on today's World Insight. 50 years to the day today since China takes back its lawful United Nations seat, the beginning of a fruitful relationship. The historical impact of restoring China's place at the UN. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight coming to you live on CGTN. Today marks the 50th anniversary of the People's Republic of China taking back its lawful UN seat. 50 years ago, an overwhelming majority passed a resolution at the 26th UN General Assembly restoring China's UN seat. In the past 5 decades, China has been committed to the UN mission of peace and development. To mark the occasion, Chinese President Xi Jinping and the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres addressed a conference in Beijing commemorating the 50th anniversary. Chinese President Xi hailed the UN seat restoration as a victory of all people, stressing China has done its part and pledged to keep cooperation with the UN toward a shared future of mankind.
Over the past 50 years, the Chinese people have consistently safeguarded the authority and position of the United Nations and practiced multilateralism. China firmly opposes all forms of hegemonism and power politics, as well as all forms of unilateralism and protectionism. We should follow the trend of pushing forward the common values of peace, development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom.
For his part, the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said that the international community needs to strengthen solidarity and cooperation. He also said upholding multilateralism, improving global governance, and achieving greater equity and justice is important. Unilateralism, according to him, is totally unacceptable. The Global Development Initiative proposed by President Xi Jinping, he said, is of great and positive significance to promote equal and balanced as well as sustainable development of the world. The UN, he says, fully supports it and also stands ready to strengthen cooperation with China in this regard. On the 50th anniversary of China taking its lawful UN seat, we are joined in Washington, D.C. via Skype by Peter Kuznick, professor of history at the American University in Shanghai, Shending Li, professor of Fudan University and vice president of Shanghai UN Research Association. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see both of you. We should say Happy UN Day, since it was the end of last week, and also a very significant day for the 50th year of China restoring its lawful seat at the United Nations. But we have heard both from the Chinese president and also the UN Secretary General talking about real multilateralism today. Obviously, that's quite an issue. Professor Kuznick, tell me more about how do you see the latest development regarding different quote-unquote understanding of multilateralism?
Well, the United States has been resistant to this idea of multilateralism, the way it's being thought about by China. As Xi Jinping stressed in his speech today, China is looking for a win-win kind of multilateralism. The United States sees this much more as a competition. And the United States has approached it in a somewhat confrontational way. When the Chinese speak about multilateralism, they're talking about sustained development goals, they're talking about economic development, they're talking about peaceful resolution of issues internationally. The United States has been hesitant to give up its hegemony. The United States has been a hegemonic force really for 76 years. So it's not the kind of thing the U.S. can give up suddenly. Mm-hmm. So the differences are evolving. And what China is looking for now is a much more United Nations based international order. The US talks about a rules-based international order. And what we've seen recently are some positive signs moving toward cooperation, but we've also seen some dangerous signs about confrontation.
Right.
Just briefly, the CIA announcing the development of a new China Mission Center. That's an important step. The announcement that the Marines and Special Forces have been training the forces on Taiwan is an important step in the negative direction. And the AUKUS agreement with Britain and Australia is another step toward confrontation. So the US and China are seeing this differently right now.
Okay.
But Xi Jinping's statement was a very positive one.
I see. Professor Shen, as you could tell, Professor Kusnik is pretty much a liberal scholar from the US, and some would even term him as left-leaning, given the current political environment in the US. But it is important to point out the differences now very differently in terms of what is multilateralism. US talk about the so-called rules-based, even though the rules, who set the rules and what kind of rules is not very clear. China, on the other hand, this time reiterated that the UN Charter and also the international law will be at the center of the global governance. So how do you see the difference of both expression and possibly in actions?
Well, actually, the idea of the United Nations was a creation by the United States and a number of important countries like China in mid-1940. The purpose is to govern the world peace by the world body, namely the new international organization which is called the United Nations. And the UN Charter is the source of all international public laws since the creation of the United Nations. That's good. The US at that time was good. But today we are talking about the real multilateralism, meaning we're against unilateralism and those faked multilateralism, which is selective multilateralism or a la carte multilateralism, which means when the US want other countries to respect American security rights, US want others to follow the UN Charter. But when it's up to China's national security and unification, even if the US has switched its official recognition from Taipei to Beijing, the US still made Taiwan Relation Act and a number of other national laws which fundamentally differs with the UN Charter, and the US wanted China to understand US and to respect American rights, to place the US law in front of the UN Charter. This is called unilateralism or a la carte multilateralism, which China and many other countries and even many American people like Professor Kuznik would vehemently be opposed to.
Do you see, Professor Shen, this is going to be the ultimate division between China and the United States in terms of global governance today?
Yes, we support Americans' original good idea, multilateralism, and we see the U.S. often violating its old heart and pursuing its realistic interest when it is good to not to follow the UN Charter, and China is willing to pay its own cost by following the UN Charter. China is not that free, but China is willing to place international law ahead of its national interest. And we think the global law, the UN law, and humanity for every country is first and foremost above any individual country's rights.
Right.
For this, China has deep difference with America.
How do you see, Professor Kusnik, if China and the United States, two major powers among a number of them in the world disagree on this fundamental principle about how the UN and the international governance system should work, what would that mean?
Well, it's actually a very dangerous situation. And I think both countries realized how dangerous it had gotten back in March, the meeting in Anchorage, which was a very tense meeting, in which the Chinese representative lectured the United States representative and said, you're not going to speak to China from a position of strength anymore, and you're not going to dictate terms. This was kind of a shock to the United States. And since then, we've had several meetings that were better. The September 9th phone call between Biden and Xi Jinping was a much more friendly and cordial phone conversation. The meeting between Yang and Sullivan this month was, again, very, very different tone than the Anchorage meeting. We've seen some positive signs. Meng's being released in Canada. These are steps in the right direction. But then we also see steps in a very negative direction.
Right.
And the tension, as Professor Shen was saying, the tension around Taiwan is very troubling to anybody who wants to be.
Many of the things that you just mentioned, Professor Kusnik, is more bilateral rather than multilateral. So eventually, this bilateral differences in terms of what the international governance system should be interpreted, what would that mean for UN, for example, and the other countries?
Well, the UN could play an important role in this, but I think it's very difficult for the UN when there's this kind of bilateral approach. The US have been much more comfortable using the UN when it's in the US interest,
right.
But when it's not, setting up other kinds of alliances.
Okay,
that's
Professor,
why this recent AUKUS.
Professor Shen, so what would that lead us to? I mean, if you look at the realities now, China does not want the UN to be paralyzed by this US, what China consider as not true multilateralism, but the selective multilateralism. However, without the US participation and some of the others, the international governance system might not be function as well as it used to be. So this is quite a dilemma, isn't it?
Yes. We try to make both China and the US and many other important stakeholders to participate in some important global governance platform. For instance, G20. G20 cannot allow every country to participate, but China and US need to be there. And APEC, and Paris climate change, and the mechanism to make Iran free of nuclear weapon, which is would involve P5 of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany and plus Iran. For all this, we have various kinds of multilateralism. For Iran, 6-party. For North Korea, 6-party. And for G20, at least 20-party. Not 200-party like UN General Assembly. Multilateralism has different formality, but the purpose is to get the important stakeholders to participate and to get consensus before anyone to take a unilateral action against any other one.
All right, I'm sure our conversation will continue. But for now, let's go to an excerpt of interview I had with the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, Liu Zhenmin. He has been talking about the economic and social affairs in the international development. He said the restoration of China's UN seat is a historic decision that reflects the global market and helps the world have a well-established UN-centered global structure. Let's listen in. Already 50 years. Wow, how time flies.
Yeah, I think 25th the celebration. China is a founding member of the United Nations. But unfortunately, I think that because of the change of the government after 1949, of the funding of the people of China. There's a difference existing among some members, especially I think between the Western powers. There could be people of China was blocked outside the UN for 22 years. That's why I think that this GA resolution is historical. First, ensure that universal membership, universality of the UN. Because I think at that time, dating back 50 years ago, Chinese population accounted for 1/4. You cannot just preclude the 1/4 population outside the United Nations system. Second, I think they improved the political structure of the international relations. 50 years ago, China is poor, but a big country.
Right.
Third point, I think economically, I think it helped to defend the global market. Globalization, actually in the 70s, already started. China is a big country with a big population. They are going to developing their own market. Now China become an important partner and supplier, and both supply and the consumer market for the world. So that globally speaking, I think this historical decision resembling of the Chinese representation in the UN is a historical representation, is to help the world to have a well-established universal structure with the United Nations as center.
That's an earlier talk I had with Mr. Liu Zhenmin, the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, talking about it was a historical decision by the United Nations to be able to restore China's lawful seat in the UN 50 years ago. Having said that, though, there are new global issues that are facing all of us. Earlier, we talked about multilateralism. Well, the reason why we talk about one kind of ism versus the other kind of ism is in the hope that we hope it will be able to solve problems. So now the problem is, how are we going to deal with climate change, pandemic? All of these things, we do not have answer. COP26 is already coming up. Many say we should not have too much expectation, too high expectations for that. So Professor Shen, tell me more about how do you see, mechanism like this will work or not for some of the biggest global issues we're facing right now?
I think we should have a consensus. We face the common challenge, a challenge to every country. That is the rise of temperature that threats our future generation and the Earth planet. Therefore, every country should take action. Those countries who are most capable of taking action, for instance, America, should be able to do it. And those countries who emit more carbon should also take a big action. But some countries historically they emit more carbon in an accumulating way. Some countries they are newcomer because they have many people like China and India. And some countries have more capability. Some countries are a newcomer. They are creating capability but not capable enough than America at this time. So we should build a consensus. Everyone should act. Second, every country are encouraged to do more, but they should act in a way that is commensurate with their capability.
Right.
Therefore, they should talk.
China already put
US say
forward.
China should do more. China say America should do more. They should talk and cooperate in order to defeat the climate change.
As all of you may know, that China has already put out now over the weekend a specific blueprint, or shall I say roadmap, about how 2025, 2030, and 2060, all the goals of carbon reduction and also carbon peak, carbon neutrality are likely to be achieved. To you, Professor Kuznick, about the U.S. side, any specifics that we can see committed by the U.S. side then, and how is the U.S. side going to rally the international community to help COP26 and other international gatherings under the UN system be a successful one?
China deserves a lot of the credit for the agreement for the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. That was an important breakthrough. What the scientific community agrees is that if there's more than a 1.5 degree increase, Celsius increase in global warming, temperature rise, then we're in very, very serious trouble. Based on the Paris Climate Accords, if all the countries reach their goals that they've set, that will increase global warming by 2.7 degrees Celsius, which is almost twice the limit that the scientific community puts on this.
I see.
We're in very, very serious crisis we're facing now as a global community. When John Kerry spoke with the Chinese leaders, the Chinese made very clear that the United States cannot ask for cooperation on certain things and attack China in other things. So we need to be able to resolve some of those tensions before we're going to be able to work together. But the world depends on this. China consumes 54% of the world's coal. That's the most seriously polluting fuel that the world has right now. So yes, the developing countries have a moral right, perhaps, to say that they're not the ones who are responsible for this, that over the long run, the United States and the developed countries have been the guilty parties.
I see.
But that doesn't make any difference with the world reality right now, is that everybody's going to be in a horrible situation
Professor
unless we
Shen.
work together.
Yeah, got your
together now
point.
to deal
Professor
with
Shen, respond, please.
You want me to say something?
Yeah, sure. Respond to what Professor Kuznick just said.
Yes. I think all countries should cooperate. And indeed, while the U.S. is attacking China on many fronts, it's very hard for China to respond in a cooperative way with America. China should work for its own interest. The interest is to defend its legitimate rights and security in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and South China Sea, and also to reduce carbon emission. But meantime, America should moderate its own behavior while expecting China to reciprocate positively on climate change. And it's not undoable. I'm very happy to see that the Chinese side is taking action and the US side is working with China quite actively. This is a positive trend, indicating the Biden administration is somehow deviating from the Trump type of multilateralism. Of course, I would not credit the Biden policy as multilateralism. We want to have the true multilateralism, not a la carte. But if America would work in some way multilateralism to replace the Trump kind of absolute unilateralism, it's still a progress.
We'll see. Well, on that, I also talked to the United Nations Development Systems Resident Coordinator in China. He describes the changes brought by China in the past 5 decades as remarkable, saying China's 14th five-year plan is fully aligned with the UN 2030 agenda. And let's take a look at the excerpt of that conversation. So much change in terms of China's status in the world, China's working with the UN and the UN as well.
You know, here is a country which struggled with poverty not too long ago. Its per capita GDP was at about $180 back in 1979. Today, the per capita GDP of China has grown to $12,000, and we expect it to go to about $25,000 by 2025. This is within 4 decades. It's within a person's lifetime.
But no, so it's dramatic.
No, it's dramatic. If a person born in 1979, basically today this person is well off.
Very true.
Is well off compared to where his or her parents were. So it's a dramatic transformation. Not just that, it lifted over 750 million people out of poverty. Now, that happening in a lifetime is also quite remarkable. And then, of course, this year, 2021, is significant because it's the 50th year of China's return to the UN. It is my first year as the United Nations resident coordinator to China. It's a privilege to be here at this time, at this moment, regardless of the geopolitics. My role is to stay faithful to the Charter. My role is to stay absolutely in lockstep with the aspiration that the Secretary General has of his resident coordinator, as well as the global development aspirations, plus the aspirations of the country. China has a 14th five-year plan. I have told the UN country team we are fully aligned, making sure that our cooperation framework works seamlessly with the same passion and determination which you see in me, and it's totally captured in the way we want to see ourselves working in lockstep with the government of China for the people of China.
That's my conversation with Siddharth Chatterjee, who is the United Nations Development System resident coordinator in China. You know, that conversation really shows how everyone in our world has to function when there are a lot of uncertainties, for example, between major powers. Yet there's important goals to be achieved, like the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. So it seems that everybody is struggling and trying to groping for the way to come out of that maze. Professor Shen and Professor Kuznick, each of you have only 1 minute, 40 seconds, I guess, to help us to understand with a conclusion about how we see today's world with 50 years China's restoration of the UN seat and the world in the future, let's just say for the 2030 development agenda. Professor Shen, you go first, 40 seconds.
With China's rights in the UN restored, China could better help the UN to represent the whole population in the world. And China upholds the principle of the United Nations, which is for peace. Therefore, promoting economy, security, human rights, decolonization, all China have been doing over the past 50 years. And that's the great achievements that UN would have China support, and China would use the UN to expand global interest. So the UN is indispensable for China and for all countries.
A place for peace. It seems to be Professor Shen's conclusion. What about Professor Kuznick?
I agree with Professor Shen about China's role. The fact that China has taken 800 million people out of poverty is an extraordinary achievement. We have to also remember that China has not engaged in a war since 1979, when it was engaged for 1 month. The United States has invaded country after country during this period. So I think but what worries me is that recently China has been more aggressive in asserting its rights and interests. I'd like to see China go back to a more cooperative, collaborative mindset and work with the United States and Russia and other countries, not to create new blocs and military alliances, but to continue to work for world peace. That's what the world needs right now.
Professor Shen, quickly respond.
Yes, I agree, but somehow I disagree with Professor Kuznick in saying that China has been working with other countries in creating blocs. Actually, China has a non-alliance policy.
Okay.
China partnering with others, but without creating military alliance.
All right. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. And that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.